to In Search of Black Power. I'm your host, Lawrence Grand Prix, Director of Research for Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle.
I'm Rasheem, independent scholar and researcher.
So today we want to talk about the politics of food sovereignty. We hear a lot about famine, malnutrition, people going hungry, but what are some of the larger policy dynamics and what are some of the larger systems at play? Rasheem, I want you to lead us through this conversation.
Sure. I think in order to start the conversation around food sovereignty, I think it's really good to get some terms out there and get on the same page about what those terms are, how they're used, and who accepts them, right? So we hear of food deserts, food swamps, food apartheid, and food sovereignty. So I want to share a few of those definitions and how they're used differently by particularly different groups and why they're used differently. So food deserts, one of the things that's really important to start off is that the Food Conservation and Energy Act of 2008, Congress directed the USDA to identify characteristics and factors that cause and influence food deserts. So in their terminology, they refer to food deserts as an area with limited access to affordable, nutritious food, particularly in areas composed of predominantly lower income neighborhoods. Very specifically, the USDA's definition is a low-income tract where a substantial number or substantial share of residents do not have easy access to supermarket or large grocery stores. It's very important, that particular distinction of how they are identifying what actual food deserts are. Then I just want to share a little bit too about how food swamps are defined. Food swamps is largely an area where an abundance of fast food, junk food outlets and convenience stores are, and then food apartheid, very more specifically. A lot of advocates, food advocates, really like to largely use the term food apartheid as opposed to food deserts. Some of the problems that they see with terms like food desert is when you say a desert, it tends to seem like it focuses on something that is a natural phenomenon and not something that is intentional or systematic. It's just a desert. Deserts also have their own ecosystem. And it also does not speak to the structural issues at play that cause it. So I'm going to read a definition of food apartheid. Food apartheid is the systematic destruction of Black self-determination to control our food. That includes the land, that includes the resource theft and discrimination. A hypersaturation of destructive foods and predatory marketing, and a blatantly discriminatory corporate-controlled food system that results in our communities suffering from some of the highest rates of heart disease, diabetes of all time.
Yeah, I was never a fan of food deserts because I've lived in the desert. I lived in Arizona for a year. I'm actually going to a conference next week out there. And there's life everywhere if you know where to look for it. And I think a similar fallacy is being presented with the Black community being called a food desert, where we may not have big grocery stores, but if you got people who are bringing food in from outside that footprint. You know, they're going to Costco, they're bringing food in. But more than that, you have people doing agriculture. Churches are never mentioned in terms of anchor institutions when it comes to feeding people. But one thing I realize is that you have Big Mama with her garden, may not be able to feed everybody, but can feed people. But a lot of older Black people, it's like, I got a person for that. I got a person, not just for crabs, but like for greens. And I got a person for onions, you know, so that you actually have a gray market. You know, not a black market, but an underground economic system that's just not studied in the mainstream academic literature. So I would say food apartheid, I think that's getting more to where I would want to go. But I would say that we have a vision of apartheid that may not match up with how I like that. Because people think that Mandela becomes like the mythical version of MLK. When in reality, Mandela was part of a violent resistance to apartheid. Apartheid ended because of the complete resistance of like socialist guerrillas in South Africa. So I think apartheid is almost sanitizes the violence that is connoted there. And it begs the question, do the people who use that term, do they really want that sort of politics to be applied to us actually addressing the question of food apartheid? Also begs the question of, after apartheid ended, do they have sovereignty in South Africa? After they do the nonprofit program to deal with your food desert, will you have sovereignty afterwards? I think it begs a bunch of questions that, I think we'd like to get deeper into, but I think the terminology is very important.
No, I 100% agree. I think one of the things that you brought up, even in identifying, for example, how you said a grandmother in the neighborhood might have a person for that, or she may have her garden that can't feed the whole neighborhood, but it feeds a particular set of folks, and some folks barter and that sort of thing. It's really important to highlight that, because if you just focus on the supermarkets, your solution is put more supermarkets, right? And it also does not pay attention to the fact that that may actually be one of the terms of food swamp. They have 15 chicken box places, all of the greasy food places, liquor stores, all of these places. So if you were just looking for specifically, and I think desert also connotes like there's nothing there. There's no food for miles. I like one aspect there's okay, how far is a supermarket? But also let's take into consideration how easily accessible are cheesy, greasy, high cholesterol, low value, over processed foods.
Yeah.
Right.
So I would say with the swamp metaphor, I think it makes sense because it reflects my personal experience. Like, I grew up all over Baltimore. Many of those places, the corner store was the only option. It was very difficult to do stuff there. But I do worry about some of the same problems with deserts kind of connotes with swamps, where it's like, there's nothing good there. It's only danger there. Because, famously in Baltimore and many black cities, you'll have, like, the fast food spot owned by the Nation of Islam. You can go get, like, a fish sub, or you can get, like, a veggie burger way before there were veggie burgers available at Burger King, right? And even in these communities where it's very difficult to get good food, it's not entirely impossible. Like, I've constructed decent meals at corner stores. It's very difficult. It's like you gotta find that one grapefruit juice left, and then you gotta get like granola bars, and you gotta maybe hope they have some sun chips or some crackers. But again, it's not the idea with swamps sometimes is that you have to totally erase or ignore the existing ecosystem. I think that's what brings in the white saviors, because they can't do it themselves. Look, they live in the swamp, so I gotta come in and save them.
Right. No, terminology is so important. I feel like it's so important to emphasize that, because that's how we identify what the solution is going to be. If the problem is they don't have enough supermarkets close by, then we put more supermarkets. But if you say that the challenge is there, if you identify the strengths in that community that already exist, and that there are sources, then that will require you to put resources into those spaces that already exist, to the local farmer, to the grandmother who may be having a limited plot to be able to share.
It also ignores some of the structural political realities that structure why these places are what they are.
Right.
So you look at the so-called Farm Bill, where we have massive subsidies for corn production. And not because people love eating corn, despite the viral videos of young black kids talking about that. That's not the only reason.
I love corn.
That person indeed does, but that's not why we have so much subsidy for corn, right? We have subsidies for corn because we feed it to pigs and hogs, and that makes the beef cheaper, right? So that's why it's like I can get a double Whopper for $2, but it's $10 for a salad,
right?
Right. And some of that's literally just physics. Like, it's easier to grow beef stock than it is to grow like lettuce in terms of a concentrated way. But it just puts us in an environment where all that corn then gets turned into corn syrup, which then gets flooded into all the products which you can buy with food stamps, right? So then there are questions of like, well, some people say we should stop people from buying Oreos on food stamps. And I think it's also important not to pathologize black people's survival behavior when it comes to compensatory realities of suffering and stress, and they also just need calories. Like, sometimes you just literally need calories, and there's more calories than a peanut butter and jelly sandwich in a salad, right? So just these realities, I just want to make sure we don't pathologize. I understand people are making rational decisions based upon the incentives placed around them. Where they have a crying child, and I can get I can get them to be quiet if I just keep feeding them chips because they're really cheap, right? While I had to go get they may not have sun chips. They may be more expensive because sun chips don't use like potatoes and corn. They use like whole wheat, which is more expensive. Right. So these are just the realities of policy structuring the incentive structure that determine behaviors downstream. But then people want to pathologize the downstream behavior as opposed to have political strategies for the upstream policy.
It's one of those. It's a like classic deflecting or what is the cause. Like when you say what's going on and what is the cause, the solution, if the people there are the problem, if the people there are too ignorant to XYZ, if there's no value there, then that promotes that whole white savior complex of like our nonprofit need to go and civilize these Negroes in terms of like how to eat and that sort of thing. Or we need to put a Whole Foods there. That's what they need. They need a Whole Foods right there. Or a Mom's. Which brings me to also one of the other terms that I wanted to highlight, and that's food insecurity, or food sovereignty, sorry. Food sovereignty entails a shift away from corporate agricultural systems and towards our own governance of our own food system. It is about the right to healthy food produce through ecologically sound and sustainable methods, with the right to define and ultimately control our own food agricultural systems. Shifting away from an exclusively rights-based framework to one of governance puts the needs of those who work and consume at all points of the food chain at the center, rather than the demands of the corporations and the markets. That definition of food sovereignty I got from courtesy of the Black Food and Justice Alliance. I think that that's really important to identify that as an aspect of food sovereignty towards a system of our own governance, and about our right to not only to eat healthy food, but our right to produce our own healthy food and have an ecologically sound and sustainable methods for doing that.
Yeah, the difference between food insecurity and food sovereignty is political power. Like, if you don't have political power, you're always food insecure. This is part of our criticism of food banks, where it's like, obviously people need calories, but without the political power, you're constantly dependent upon that food bank for your survival. And it may not be able to provide you food in the way that you culturally consume it, or you just logistically consume it. Like, some of the limitations of food stamps is you can't buy hot food with food stamps. And given the nature of people working service jobs and being mobile and doing public transit, it's kind of punishing. Even because they make, people sometimes it's healthier than what they eat at home. It's what they get outside. Chipotle might be healthier than the cheesy pasta they have at home, but you can't buy Chipotle with your food stamp card. Right. So these are just some of the political realities that need to be changed. Because without political power, you're always food insecure.
Yeah, absolutely. With some of those terms too, and identifying like how does this happen? How historically have we got in a situation where we have, whether you prefer the term food deserts or food swamps or food apartheid, how did some of this happen? So some of the historical influences that came up were white flight, where just basically when white flight happened, businesses went to those areas, went to more affluent areas. Also, racially biased zoning codes, racially biased lending practices, supermarket redlining, as well as things like union busting. A few other things that I think is probably good to point out legally in terms of how we look at food, how food is so political. One of them is that the Healthy Food Access for All Americans Act, reintroduced in the 117th Congress, that would establish tax credits and grants to certain food providers in areas considered to be food deserts. So when we talk about where the problem is, and we decide what the solution is based on that, who's going to get that tax credit based on that, right?
And what does that mean for that community? Because you might think it's a good idea to open a supermarket now, but if that's a engine for gentrification that people see, then a lot of this investment may not be for you. It may be for the people that real estate capital is trying to get to replace you, right? So just being sure that people are cognizant of that when they see these policies that sound good, but may not. You got to think downstream in terms of some of the impacts.
Right. Another thing, and I won't go to each one of these, but I'll go to this one, and that is, although the 2014 Farm Bill repealed in 2008, this Farm Bill provision, USDA continues to develop and report that same data from 2008. Current USDA estimates for 2019 are available in Food Access Research Atlas data. I'm really curious about, and maybe you might have some insight into this, Grand Prix. If in 2014, the 2014 Farm Bill repealed the 2008 Farm Bill provision, why would USDA continue to develop reports based on the 2008?
Well, this is where actual civic education is really important. I don't have all the details, but I can project. One thing we all know that happened in 2017 is that Trump decimated many parts of the bureaucracy. So sometimes with the bureaucracy being decimated, Republicans see that as a tool to limit government. So if the person who needed to do the report wasn't hired or was seen as a political hiring, then that made it so the report didn't get done. Also, agriculture is extremely political in America. So some people know that the first state to vote for president in the primaries is Iowa. So we actually have, going back to it, a multi-billion-dollar subsidy for corn, not just because of all the reasons I said before, but because it keeps people in Iowa employed, and they vote for president in the primaries first. So we actually have this thing called an ethanol subsidy. You can actually put like a chemical process that turns corn into alcohol that you put in your, and like fuel you put in your car. So this ethanol subsidy, you can actually kind of cut. You can cut gasoline with this corn gas. And it's not really energy efficient because you got to like pour fertilizer on the corn to make it grow. What is fertilizer made of? Petrochemicals, oil. It's not really efficient, but it makes millions of dollars for farmers in Iowa, right? And Iowa is so politically powerful because it's the first primary state for the presidency. So the reality is that there could be all types of politics that go into how this data is presented, because if you actually objectively look at the data, you can find some things in the data that could be really detrimental to your political standing. And one of those things is racial bias. So have you heard of the Pickford case, Pickford versus Griswold?
Only recently.
Yes, we've been talking about this. So just want to kind of transition here. The Pickford case was a very well-known case I believe it was started in the 90s around farm subsidies being denied to black farmers. As we know, there's a strong agricultural tradition here in America with black folks. And you are supposed to be able to get subsidies to support your agricultural activity if you meet the basic criteria of like size, production, all those other things. But what they found is that in many states, black folks are being denied access to these subsidies and loans. They sued, and they actually won in federal court. And this is where some of the nuance comes in terms of how we actually achieve food sovereignty. This case was held up as a template for reparations for some people. Because these folks are owed billions of dollars that they actually have a system to pay out. But the reality is that because it's so legalistic, they were so dependent on lawyers, so dependent upon paperwork and all the legal nuances, that this food sovereignty supporting decision was actually, I think, a prime example of the limitations of using court advocacy to achieve black sovereignty in this area. So I just want to read a few details for the audience. And the quote goes like this. So this thing is called a consent decree. It's the same thing they have for policing, where basically the federal government settles with like an entity like the states, and it's like, we'll do what we say so we don't like sue you or punish you. But anytime you hear consent decree, your BS detector should go up, because consent decrees are extremely legalistic process and subject to legal manipulation. So here's the consent decree around Pickford and some of the things that happen with it. Quote, under the consent decree, an eligible recipient is an African American who, one, farmed or attempted to farm between January 1st, 1981 and December 30th, 1996. 2, applied for USDA for farm credit or program benefits and believes that he or she was discriminated against by the USDA on the basis of race. And 3, made a complaint against the USDA on or before July 1st, 97. First red flag, you had to file a complaint.
Right.
Right, so that was the first red flag. So let's continue. The Pickford consent decree basically establishes a 2-track dispute resolution mechanism for those seeking relief. The most widely used option is Track A, provides a monetary settlement of $50,000 plus relief in forms of government forgiveness, loan forgiveness, and offsets for tax liability. Track A claimants had to present substantial evidence of a reasonable basis for finding discrimination happened. Right, so it's only $50K, subject to a reasonability requirement, extremely arbitrary. What's reasonable? So just wrapping up here, the current status. This is as of the early 2010s. In general, there seems to be a consensus that many of the issues surrounding the implementation of Pickford can be attributed to gross underestimation of the number of claims that have actually been filed. At the same time, many in Congress and those closely associated with the settlement agree have voiced much concern over the large percentage of denials, especially under Track A virtually automatic cash payout. Interest groups have suggested that relatively poor approval percentages, 69%, can be attributed to the consent decree requires that the claimant show that treatment was, quote, less favorable than that accorded specific, identified, similarly situated white farmers. So you have to use whiteness as a standard, and it has to be similarly situated. What do we know? White farmers tend to have more wealth. White farmers tend to have more resources. So basically the poor white farmers And if they say I'm not racist, I also deny poor white farmers. And it's no finding of reasonability, right?
So a person would have to meet every last one of those criterias, or a reasonable number of those
Well,
criteria.
part of it with legal status is that you have to meet every legal check mark. And actually, it becomes extremely onerous. So let me actually just complete the quote, which gets to what you're getting at. More alarming to many, however, was the large percentage of farmers who did not have their cases heard on the merits because they filed late. Out of the approximately 20,700 timely requests for consideration, 17,279 requests have been declined. Others countered these claims by arguing that the Pigford Notice Program was designed in part to promote awareness and could not make someone file. Someone also suggested, including many of the claimants, that the class counsel was responsible for an inadequate notice and overall mismanagement of the settlement agreements. Judge Friedman, for example, cautioned that the farmers' lawyers for their failure to meet deadlines and described their representation at one point as bordering on legal malpractice. So these are the realities of the difficulty of having political nuance and political engagement with food sovereignty, where you can have a stunning decision like Pigford go your way, but if you don't meet the legal bureaucracy the way that they want to be met or are used to being met, then they can find some arbitrary reason to deny your request. I've also heard, details of when the money starts flowing, that's when the Lyle Landleys come, the hucksters, the shysters, the lawyers who are coming to take your money. And also just like family disputes, like their family disputes over land, their family disputes over settlements. There's just all these interpersonal dynamics, structural dynamics that need to be thought about when you're thinking about food sovereignty.
I mean, I feel like there's so many points. I mean, it's not surprising that so many cases didn't go through when you look at all of the requirements, right? Like, even if I just look at that you were discriminated, like, I have to go back and prove discrimination, and then I had to have filed, because a lot of times, sometimes discrimination becomes so commonplace. You're just like, I don't want to deal with the headache of it.
Yeah. I didn't even see the similarly situated white farmer provision. I think that's stunning, because all they have to do is say, like I said, I also discriminated against white people.
Right. I'm an equal opportunity discriminator.
Exactly. Poor white people, especially. And again, part of what I think needs to be talked about is that even if you win, they're pushing you into very high-level industrialized agriculture. What do you do when you do that? You take out huge loans. So even winning in this case means you're getting in the agricultural big ag system, where you're taking out huge loans, growing oftentimes seed from a corporation like formerly Monsanto. I know they changed their name. And you have to grow only their product and grow a monoculture and sell to the commodities markets, pray you have a good price, pay back your loan, and hopefully you live on what's left. Some people say that sounds a lot like sharecropping. I think that's the reality of food sovereignty is beyond just having black farmers. It's having black farmers that are economically and politically independent to grow what they want, grow how they want, and grow in a way that actually feeds the community and not the commodities markets.
Yeah, I mean, whether it's the black farmers or it's the grandmother that you're talking about that has applied, and I'm not a grandmother yet, but I like you. I mean, Grand Prix knows this. I love food. I love all aspects of food. I love growing food. I don't have a particular desire to be like some big farmer, but if I did get, like if an everyday person, let's say, got some sort of, I don't know, subsidy, support, or tax around it, they would probably grow more, share it more, and have those resources in their communities a lot more. Some of the areas that's largely impacted by food deserts, like in general, let me say, in some of the reading that I did, about 19 million people live in what they call food deserts, and they are disproportionately African American or disproportionately largely people of color. Right. So some of those areas, and this is by no means an exhaustive list, I'm just going to name 3 locations. So there's Detroit, where they had a national chain of grocery stores from 1920s up until 2007. The last grocery store chain called Farmer Jack closed their doors in 2007. Did you want to speak on that?
Yeah, I mean, Detroit's undergoing a bit of gentrification now, so they may have some stuff downtown. And again, it depends on how you build it. Because in theory, You could have a grocery store downtown with a central location and central public transit, and that could actually maybe help with food deserts because maybe they don't need it in their backyard if they can get what they need downtown. But then you're dealing with people carrying their groceries. A lot of old elderly people can't get down there. So, but more than that, downtown real estate's super expensive.
Yeah.
So the type of food supermarkets that go there tend to oftentimes be overpriced, right? So there are these potential solutions to food insecurity that may not always rely on the physical presence of just a business in your community, because that business is still capitalist, right? You're still seeking profit. But you need to think about solving the actual problem, how you get nutritious food into people's bodies, which again could be a downtown food distribution center, but then you want to have transportation assistance, right? Maybe help people with Ubers. There are all type of things you can do. But again, I think that we'll talk about it, just the obsession with, I want a grocery store in my backyard, because that's what white people got. That can lead us astray.
Yeah, I think that's such a good point. It makes me think of Chicago, Illinois, specifically Garfield Park. They recently lost a major grocery store in February of 2022. And now, in terms of other solutions, they have pop-up stores. I think it's also important to point out when these things are happening, there are people that are already connected largely in these communities, in these cities, doing some of the work, right, to provide support around building food security. So some of the ones that just came up in my research of this in Chicago, Illinois, were 40 Acres, Fresh Mart, Top Box, Garfield Park Community, Right to Wellness. Those names came up around folks who were doing pop-up grocery stores. I could say right here in Baltimore, we have Black Yield Institute, we have the Black Church Food Security Network, we have Strength to Love Farm 1 and 2, Black Urban Gardening Society. There's folks in community that are doing the work. So even when I think about what we talk about as potential solutions, we should be tapping into at minimum, first go to the people who are already on the ground doing the work so that they can inform, here are some of the barriers, here are some of the challenges, and leverage and support them in what they're already doing.
Yeah. And I think that thinking of community input, I wanted to do a little bit of analysis about how the food desert conversation and politics have happened here in Baltimore, because I think it's demonstrative of some things that we talk about on this channel, and I think it'd be a useful example. So if you look at the food deserts map of Baltimore, you can see the smattering of red on the west side and a smattering of red on the east side. And so to some of you, this might look familiar because this also mimics, if you go to the next picture, the actual segregation redlining map of Baltimore. So many of the areas in Baltimore that are currently deemed food deserts and are red on the first slide are redlined, literally red on the map for federal investment on the second slide. And as you can see now on the third slide, the green is where black people live. So the green is where black people live. That's also where the redlining happened. That's also where the food deserts are. So with this correlation, many people have said this is an example of racial inequity. This is the so-called black butterfly. And therefore, they talk about this as being denied access to the benefits of society. I think that's obviously true, but what I feel like is missing is the political recommendation to what to do about that. Because if you want explicit about having community-centered power as your politics, then the logical solution is just give black people what white people got, which is a grocery store, which is what we did. Baltimore had a chain of grocery stores called Super Pride. Now, I know you actually didn't grow up in Baltimore, but anyone who actually did, they know probably what I'm talking about. Super Pride was very well known. You can see a picture of it here when it was opened in 1987. This was actually a Super Pride on Hartford Road in Oliver. Super Pride was founded in 1970 by Charles Thurgood Burns, a cousin of Thurgood Marshall, Associate Justice of the Supreme Court. The food chain grew to 7 stores with annual sales reaching $43 million, making one of the top 100 black-owned businesses. That sounds great. However, supermarkets are an incredibly low profit margin business. Every supermarket. So while you have sales totaling $43 million, what are your expenses?
Right.
And this is the part where if you don't have deep access to capital, many of our black businesses, even when they become successful, can't always compete. And even when the community has pride in them, that's where the Pride name came from. So this is a picture of what happened to the Super Pride in Howard Park on the west side. So you can see it's run down. you can see that it's kind of like hovering over the community, this symbol of blight. But it's also a symbol in many people's minds of black business failing. Like I remember going to the Super Pride as a kid, and I remember seeing it boarded up and feeling some type of way about that. So this is kind of the symbol of black businesses failing. So what they say is, well, we need white business. And this community organized for years and years and years to get a grocery store, but also have some community control. Say things that we want fresh food, we want hot food, we want to be able to have a grocery store that meets our needs, but you got to appeal to the white market. You have to appeal to white business people to meet your needs. And the good news is that they were actually able to get a grocery store. The bad news is that as of 2020, that grocery, and it's a nice grocery store, but as of 2020, that grocery store, which had received millions of dollars in support from the city, was asking for more loan forgiveness from the city because the economics weren't working.
Right.
Which is what, unfortunately, one could have predicted if you know anything about grocery stores. Because the reality is that grocery stores sell affordable food, but they have expensive items that make the profit margins to allow them to sell the affordable food. If you're serving lower income people, they buy less, not none, but less of the expensive items that have the high profit margin items. And they make it hard for the economics to work. So now they're asking for loan forgiveness for these millions of dollars of subsidies they got from the city. And while, again, I think it's logical that the people of Highwood Park would want to have a white people guide, what would have happened 7, 8 years ago when the supermarket came, 9, 10 years ago when they were planning it, if we had had 10 years of investment in food sovereignty in that community during that time? Because right now, obviously, we don't have systems that can feed thousands of people. But what if we actually invested in the agricultural and political capacity to expand the power of black people to do that work? And I think that's the thing that gets missing when you just turn to white people got it, I want it. Right? And that's just this impulse of our denial of historically leads to that being our frame of politics, that we have to fill in that void. But understanding how politics works, and again, unfortunately, you know, the economic limitations of the supermarket were very predictable. And again, it just shows you that it wasn't necessarily Super Pride's fault, because Super Pride at the end was like dirty and it's associated with like having rats and all this other stuff. And that's not black business failing per se. That's just the market. So you have to recognize that these market dynamics are real, but sometimes we just tie it to, well, the black people was failing. If the white people come in, they'll do it right. Right. And that can't be a political theory that our food sovereignty is tied to.
No, totally agreed. I think, you know, anytime there's things like I say we just recently, like we're completely over a pandemic, but we're not. We were just recently experiencing the height of a pandemic. So all of these things are like super compounded when you add into it a global pandemic. So those areas where people are living in food deserts or food swamp or experiencing a food apartheid are experiencing them to a heightened degree in a lot of cases. I know for myself, I'm in a situation where I can order groceries to have them, for example, delivered. So distance and all of those things aren't necessarily an issue. In keeping with a conversation around Baltimore, you shared a little bit about the history of some of the things that happened in terms of supermarket network and Black-owned supermarket. I'm going to just read this little blurb from something that Baltimore got from ARPA funding. So it says, city announces an additional $11 million in American Rescue Plan Act funding to build equitable and resilient food systems, right? This came out Friday, May 20th of 2022. Mayor Brandon Scott has announced an additional allocation of $11 million in ARPA funds towards building equitable and resilient food systems to mitigate the negative impacts associated with food insecurity and after COVID-19 pandemic. This brings the city's total commitment to providing nutritional security for Baltimoreans to $26 million. The $11 million investment will support 5 key pillars in the Department of Planning, Food Policy, and Planning Division Nutritional Service and Program. So 1, continuation of producing box distribution, online SNAP fruit and vegetable incentives, expansion of nutrition incentives at farmers market, MedStar Harbor Hospitals, Good Food, RX program or medical program. And 5, the Farm Alliance of Baltimore's Black Butterfly Urban Farmer Academy. This comprehensive approach will improve access to healthy, affordable food while addressing the food supply chain failures seen throughout the pandemic. When you see that those 5 areas that it is tackling, does that connect to you to an effort towards food sovereignty?
Well, we're running out of time.
Okay.
But I will.
That's something for everyone to think about.
Yeah. So I will say that I'd want to know more about the specifics of these programs.
Yeah.
But I think a lot about how people consume food. Mm-hmm. So how people buy food. So many people using SNAP, which is what food stamps are called now, mm-hmm. they aren't really, I think, the core demographic for online shopping. Mm-hmm. But only online could they give the plus-up subsidy to it. So you'd have to have a big outreach to teach them about the value of having this additional subsidy and shift that culture. Because a lot of folks are just getting how they live. Like they're out in the world getting what they can. So unfortunately, the demographic of online food shopping may not overlap with SNAP recipients. I'd also say that similarly with farmers markets. I like farmers markets. I imagine you like farmers markets. Yeah. I'm not sure the top food insecure people are the demographic for farmers markets. Right. And also box distribution is like box lunches. I mean, I know how I felt about box lunches as a kid. It's like when you were really, really hungry, it's like I was glad to have them. But is that a long-term solution for food needs? And remember where the ARPA money comes from. This was a one-shot, one-time investment of federal dollars. That was not black politics that led to that investment. That was interest convergence with the pandemic. Yeah. Democratic administration wanted to pump some money into Democratic cities. What happens if that money runs out? How are we going to build a local tax base and shift local resources to make this sustainable beyond this temporary investment in our community? So I think understanding some of these underlying dynamics of how money flows, how power flows, I'd like to see what people in the academy are leading into. Are they leading into, growing for larger companies? Are they leading into building sustainable models for urban agriculture? Because as you know, just growing stuff in your backyard is great if you're eating it. But is that a sustainable business plan? I know people who had to sell a bunch of herbs to high quality restaurants because that's the only thing they could grow at scale that can make them enough money to even be a little sustainable. But I'm not eating garlic. Right. I'm eating collard greens. I'm eating kale. I'm eating carrots. And how do you make that economically sustainable? Right. It may have to be some grant money, but where's it coming from? Some local money. But you still gotta have a business plan. I still think the idea of all the limitations of black business alone is a solution. Having the community buy your food makes you in some way accountable to the community. So I don't want people selling their garlic to a fancy restaurant and having the charity bin of kale on the side. How do you make it so that the actual institutional apparatus of these institutions are somehow accountable to black people? And I think that's the struggle. That's why we continue to go in search of black power. Because we haven't quite found it yet, but we'll get there. All right. Thank you. I look forward to seeing y'all next time.
See ya.